This is a special edition of Wall Street Week from Aspen, Colorado, where we've come for the annual Aspen Economic Strategy Group meetings, bringing together economic experts and business leaders for a nonpartisan, detailed discussion of some of the big economic issues in front of us. This year, the focus is on building a more resilient U.S. economy, with a discussion ranging from things like the debt and deficit to tax policy to where we're headed with artificial intelligence. We'll hear from special contributor Larry Summers of Harvard, his fellow former Treasury Secretaries Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner, former Honeywell CEO Dave Cote, and regional Fed presidents Austan Goolsbee of Chicago and Raphael Bostic of Atlanta. But we start with the distinguished labor economist who until recently was interpreting these numbers for President Biden. She is Cecilia Rouse.
What the Department of Labor reported today was that the U.S. economy added about 187,000 jobs last month, which is a robust number. It's the kind of number that I'm confident my colleagues at the Biden administration celebrated, because what we've known is we had the pandemic-induced recession. We saw the fastest growth out of that, but we also know that that kind of growth of 300,000 jobs a month is not sustainable. That's not consistent with an economy that has reached its, whether we want to call it steady state, but it is a naturally, robust economy. And so we've been looking for and anticipating and kind of a cooling. Last year, President Biden had an op-ed. It was, I think, the Wall Street Journal anticipating this. But it's not even just about the president there. It's just that that's what we want to see. That is what the Federal Reserve is looking for, is a labor market that remains remarkably resilient. I will say that. So it is robust, but where we have the annual jobs numbers looking more consistent with just sort of typical turnover in a strong economy.
As you say, remarkably resilient. As a labor economist, have you been surprised, not the snapback after the pandemic, but at the continued robustness? Because 187,000 jobs may not be 200,000, but it's a lot more than you need to have just to absorb the new additions of people to the workforce.
Absolutely, and it's slightly more than you would expect to see with an unemployment rate of 3.5%. And at this stage of the economic recovery. So it has been remarkably resilient. If you think about the changes in the inflation rate over the past year, inflation has come down quite a bit, and yet we've not seen much evidence of any impact on the labor market. So this, for me, this goes back to the massive disruption caused by the pandemic, which affected every aspect of our economy in the U.S., globally. And that it goes to the disruption was on the supply side. We definitely had the robust assistance on the fiscal side, on the monetary side, to ensure that we could get through the pandemic without too much disruption to our way of life and to our economic, our economic health. And that this is an economy that is knitting itself back together. But it has been surprisingly resilient.
We also, I believe, saw a little bit of a reduction in the average hours worked per week. Is that potentially an indication maybe the labor market started to soften a little bit around the edges?
So, again, we want to see a little bit of softening. Right. That's what the Federal Reserve is looking for. It's important that we not focus on any one month's numbers, but that could be a sign that a little bit of cooling here and there. Our unemployment insurance claims numbers remain very low. The job openings numbers remain very high. So we fundamentally have a strong labor market with some signs that there's some cooling as we would hope to see.
We've been through an extraordinary period of time for the labor market, among other markets, because of the pandemic. We now are coming back from that. Is it too early to ask ourselves, are there structural changes, do we think, in the labor market that may last well into the future?
I think it's a little early to tell. I mean, we certainly hope there will be. We do know, for example, if we look at the economy more broadly, during the pandemic, we had the massive rotation of consumption of goods over services. That is renormalizing, but we still see that our services consumption isn't quite back where it was before. So we would anticipate to see, more employment growth there, maybe a little bit less in goods. So we expect to see some of those changes. Here at Aspen, we've been having a lot of discussion about generative AI. and technological change and what kinds of changes that will bring to our labor market and our economy, that is going to come very quickly. It looks like it's, if we look at the speed of adoption, that could come very quickly. That could generate some changes. There are changes in our trading partners and what's happening globally. If you look at the Biden administration's infrastructure investments, the chips, that's generating more construction. And so we have many changes that are happening. It'll be hard to see what sticks, what doesn't stick.
You mentioned the generative AI, which has been the subject of a lot of discussion here at the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. And it's early on. At the same time, one of the things we're hearing is it's coming really fast and very broadly,
yes.
In a very broad sense. As a labor economist, what will you be looking at in terms of what we need to do to adjust our workforce for a world of really broad-based AI?
So we all embrace technology, and in our economy and over history, we have all benefited from technological changes such as this generative AI. It can be disruptive in the short term. And I think the hope is that this will be more complementary with labor, meaning that this kind of technological change allows workers to work better, increase productivity, as opposed to being an absolute substitute for labor, so that we see firms using the technology instead of workers. So that is the challenge. There'll be some of both. I think we hope that it'll be more complementary than substituting for labor. But that's what I think we'll be looking for. We saw numbers about what fraction of occupations, in a certain fraction of the labor force, these kinds of technologies are substituting for particular tasks, but not for complete jobs. That may be where it starts. It's hard to imagine that's where it ends.
None of us want to see people out of work. At the same time, some substitution of labor maybe could be beneficial, because if we look at the demographic trends in the United States,
Absolutely.
A lot of the other developed world, in China as well, by the way, has issues. But in the United States, right now, there's a question about whether we're going to have the workers we need going forward.
Absolutely. Again, technological change has traditionally, over the millennia, actually benefited us as an economy, as a society. And we do know we have this headwind where our working age population is expected to decline. We know demographically we're going to have even more retirements, and our fertility rate is low, which means that there's going to be a time when our working age population is smaller than it is today. And having this kind of technological change where we increase the productivity, so any one worker is able to do more and produce more than workers today, that will benefit us all and help us maybe thread this needle and nonetheless remain a robust economic system going forward.
Dr. Cecilia Rouse, thank you so much for being on Wall Street. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That is Cecilia Rouse, who until recently was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Coming up, we'll hear from our special contributor here on Wall Street Week, Larry Summers, about whether he thinks it's time for him to start joining some of the others, like Bank of America economists, and deciding that maybe we won't have that recession after all. That's next on Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin, and we are joined here in Aspen, Colorado by our very special contributor on Wall Street Week. He is Larry Summers of Harvard. So, Larry, great to be with you here in Aspen. At the end of the week, we got the jobs numbers, and they were a little light on the number of jobs, 187,000 as opposed to 200,000. A little heavy, actually, on the wage increases. What do you make of them?
Look, nobody should change their minds fundamentally on the basis of these numbers. They were pretty close to expectations. As you said, economy was softer and inflation was a bit stronger than expected, so that's not terrific. But again, not a big deal from these numbers. Look, I think the big story here all along is we're trying to land the plane on the runway, where we're worried that the plane would crash short of the runway. That certainly does not look like it's going to happen. We've got a very strong economy, and we're worried that the plane will overshoot the runway. If you look at wage inflation, it was faster for the month than for the quarter, faster for the quarter than for the year, and running for the quarter at about 4.9%. That's not consistent with 2% underlying inflation or close, and unemployment ticked down, vacancies ticked up. We still have a tight labor market, a very tight labor market, and with 187,000 jobs created and population growing 50 to 100,000 a month, we have not just a tight labor market, but a tightening labor market. Now, it's true, as some will point out, that we're tightening relative to a tight state at a slower rate than we were before, and that's encouraging, but fundamentally the plane is not yet on a trajectory to a soft landing within the runway. And
well, let's continue with your analogy about the plane trajectory. Where do we need to get on the right trajectory to get to 2% within some reasonable period of time? What sort of numbers do you look for example, in wage increases? Right now we're going about 4.4% year over year. What sorts of numbers do you look for on unemployment rate? What are the key factors in figuring that trajectory?
So part of the issue is that it's 4.4 year over year, but it's 4.9 quarter over quarter, and it's probably closer to 5.0 month over month. And so it's not that it is on a decelerating path.
But does that suggest inflation may bounce back up?
Broadly, inflation is the difference between wage growth and productivity growth. And you can argue about where productivity growth is going to be. I would guess, but it's anybody's guess, somewhere between 1 and 1.5%. So that would tell you that the kind of inflation we're having is wage inflation we're having is pointing to an underlying inflation rate in the 3.5 range, and it may not be decelerating. Those are numbers I'll be watching closely. I'll be watching the core inflation numbers. Look, there's no necessary unemployment. Nobody wants to see any unemployment, certainly not any increase in unemployment. But what we know is that if we don't contain inflation, it sets the stage for all sorts of very serious problems elsewhere. And I don't think we can yet be confident that we're not going to see a reacceleration of inflation at some point down the road. And that's the thing that I'm focused on, not some precise numerical target for inflation, but whether there's a sense that this is under control. And I think we'll have to wait and see. Again, the numbers have come in a bit better over the last few months than I would have guessed, but I find the declarations of victory by some to be substantially premature. I'm glad that the Fed is not among those who are declaring victory, and I find the idea that this vindicates the view of those who have been unconcerned about inflation all along to be a bit bizarre, since what we followed was very different policies than the ones that they have been pushing.
So another development this week was the Fitch downgrading the U.S. sovereign debt, and also the Treasury saying they have to borrow more money, which really roiled the bond markets. I think it's fair to say. You really saw, particularly in the long end, it came up a bit. You've already said you're not so sure if Fitch in and of itself is that significant, but is there a fundamental underlying issue here? You're out here as one of the leaders of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, and there's a lot of discussion now about what's going on fiscally with the United States.
Look, David, I have written and said that I don't think we're on a sustainable fiscal path. I think the Congressional Budget Office is pretty pessimistic. It thinks the deficit's going to be in the 7% range once we get out 8 or 10 years, and they think we're going to be reducing defense spending relative to GDP. I think that's wrong given the threats we face. They think that Treasury bill interest rates going to average in the low 2s. I think that's not close to right given the strains that we face. They assume, because they're required to, that all the Trump tax cuts will phase out. I don't think that's going to happen. They haven't really fully recognized that revenues are coming in well below expectation this year. I think if you do the forecast right, you're looking at a number close to 10. I don't think the United States is going to tell bondholders they're not getting money. I think the fact that we worked through, even in an incredibly toxic political environment, the debt limit settled that issue. I look at so-called credit default swaps on the United States, and they haven't moved. So I don't think Fitch really is contributing usefully to the debate here. I think they're just sort of flailing for relevance, and in general, rating agencies have not proven very prescient. They tend to follow markets rather than lead them. But I do think for anyone who's concerned about inflation, for anybody who's concerned about our resilience as a country and as an economy, you know, we talk constantly these days about the importance of resilience. Well, if you think about a company or you think about a household, not being leveraged to the hilt is an important part of being resilient. And I wish that aspect of resilience would preoccupy our policymakers as much as the ones that can be translated into arguments for creating some jobs in Ohio. Because I think that's something that is a very, very important aspect of resilience.
Larry, great to be with you here in Aspen. That's Larry Summers, our very special contributor here on Wall Street Week. Coming up, we'll hear from two other former Treasury Secretaries, Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner, about efforts that they are leading to try to put the United States back on the proper fiscal track. That's next on Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. On Wednesday, we woke up to the unexpected news that Fitch had downgraded U.S. sovereign debt, and then learned that the Treasury would have to borrow yet more money to cover the deficit that we're running, all of which made the meetings at the Aspen Economic Strategy Group even more timely, because the subject this year was building a more resilient U.S. economy. So we met with the two chairs of the organization. They're the former Treasury Secretaries, Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner, and we got their thoughts about what they're trying to do to help the U.S. get back on the right fiscal track. Tim Geithner, Hank Paulson, co-chairs at the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. So Hank, let me start with you. You've been a chair here a bit longer. What do you hope to accomplish this week in these meetings?
Well, David, when we set this up, our goal was to create a forum where we had cutting-edge economic research, evidence-based research, where we could discuss and debate it on a nonpartisan basis. And one of the things we really want to do is also create a forum where we can have economic leaders get to know each other, build bonds, and do it across generations, across sectors, and across parties. And then we want this research to have a real-world impact. So that's our goal. And so far, over the last 6 years, I think the group has been coming together, and I'm sort of very pleased with the way it's developed.
And Tim, the subject of the meetings this year is building fiscal resilience in the U.S. economy. Couldn't be more timely. A lot of talk about that even this week. This week, the Fitch ratings is also borrowing more of the Treasury. Putting those to one side, what do we need to do to build fiscal resilience?
Well, the topic is about economic resilience more broadly. Fiscal resilience is one part of those things. And, you know, if you look at the economy today, it's a pretty resilient economy. You know, we've been through a lot of challenges, and we look pretty strong today in a relative sense. But we have a lot of long-term challenges, and the fiscal challenges are part of those challenges. And, you know, if you think about all the things we face in this more dangerous world, and, you know, a country with very high levels of poverty and huge challenges in innovation, it's important to make sure that we have people focused on research that can help inform better public policy choices at the national level in these things. And that requires bringing people together from all sorts of disciplines, all parts of the economy, both parties, trying to figure out how to build trust and knowledge to help shape those outcomes.
Hank, looking at the program, one of the issues that can be talked about is how much money we're spending, the deficit and the debt. That subject's been around for quite a while. You've dealt with it before. What are the prospects of actually coming up with solutions that might be implemented?
Well, let me tell you something. I'm an optimist. You need to be an optimist to do what we're doing. And I believe what we're doing here is a major step forward in doing this. Because if we can have great research and get people together across parties and come up with some terrific ideas and get the facts out in think tanks to both political parties, we can make progress. Now, you're right. The trajectory, our fiscal trajectory, is concerning. But we're a rich country and we've got time to deal with it. But we need to do some things in the next few years to change that trajectory. And I think that's going to be very important. And to do that, it's going to take doing things on both the spending side and the revenue side. We're going to need more revenues, and we're going to need to figure out how to deal with some difficult issues in areas like the entitlements.
It strikes me that one of the things the two of you share, besides having been Treasury Secretaries, is being in Washington time where you had a pretty good sense of what needed to get done, but getting it done is harder than figuring out the answer. And I wonder if that might be true when it comes to debt and deficit, entitlements, taxes right now.
Yeah, I mean, these long-term things that are very hard, you can't do with just one party.
Yeah.
You have to do them in a way that commands broader support across the political spectrum, and you have to build that. And you know, why are people disappointed with outcomes from this political system? It's partly because people are uncertain about what works. They don't know how to think about the trade-offs. And so by giving them a better basis of knowledge for making those trade-offs, thinking about the range of outcomes solutions that might work, you can improve the odds that we bend the arc of governance closer to something that's competent.
Hank, is that your experience? I mean, you'll come out of this conference with some pretty serious papers, with some very specific proposals, some analyses. Is it your experience in Washington that somebody, even if they aren't the legislators themselves, their staffs, people in the executive branch will read those and be influenced by them?
Yes, and we're trying to keep the fires burning. We are not focused on the short term. Okay, we're focused on the longer term. But if we can, as Tim said, if we can put forward some good ideas, show the trade-offs, put forward a range of alternatives, right? So when we all talk, and we use Chatham House rules, very candid conversations, and when we get Democrats and Republicans together, there's really not that much difference between us, right? And that gives me hope. So again, the idea is to get the ideas out, get them out to both parties, get them out to think tanks, and the time will come when things need to get done, and the sooner the better. But there's no doubt when we are in government, when Tim and I were sitting in the seat at Treasury, we found it difficult and challenging to get things done. We don't have that position now. But what we can do is hopefully bring people together, and I'm really focused on the future leaders, you know, and getting them involved in this process with the AESG.
Tim, it's thought by some outside of Washington that Washington doesn't do the sorts of things that Hank's talking about unless there's a true crisis. There could be a true crisis at some point down the road. As Hank said, it's not yet, but it could come. We could have trouble borrowing the money we need. Is it fair to say Washington's not going to do anything until there's a true crisis?
I hope not. I mean, it is true. I think Churchill said famously that the United States, in the end, after trying all the alternatives, usually does the right thing. You know, but you want to move the system to act before it's late and hard.
That was former Treasury Secretaries Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner. A good part of the money that the U.S. is spending is on various infrastructure and clean energy projects. Is it part really of a new industrial policy? We asked the former CEO of Honeywell, he's Dave Cote, about whether that makes sense and how it should be done. That's coming up next on Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
Industrial policy. It's been credited with Japan's remarkable economic growth after World War II, overseen by the famous, some might say infamous, MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. Now the United States is trying out its own form of industrial policy as Congress passed first the Inflation Reduction Act, including $370 billion for climate-related investments.
We have deep plans for longer-term investments in key sectors, including standing up semiconductors, electric vehicles, electric batteries.
And then another $52 billion for the U.S. semiconductor industry.
The CHIPS Act is a seminal act for, this may be the most significant industrial policy legislation that's been put in place since World War II in the U.S. This is huge. This is good for the industry, it's good for the United States, and Intel will be a beneficiary thereof, and I'm proud to have played a part in getting it across the line.
All of which has triggered something of a subsidies competition between the United States and allies such as Canada over the IRA.
Yes, the IRA is something that we've had to step up to make sure we're competitive, but we're going to be a lot more strategic about how we, pick and choose the right investments. We can't just do it blanket like the US can.
And the European Union over chips.
Microchips, they are the backbone of Europe's industrial competitiveness in a digital world. The green and the digital transition, well, it requires new, advanced technological solutions. And this is why we must increase Europe's own chips research, development, production capabilities.
But the biggest challenge may be making sure all this money will make our economies stronger rather than simply some companies richer.
The whole point of this is to increase innovation, research, and development in the industry. Not, we're not giving you taxpayer money to fluff your pillow and increase your profit and give it away to your shareholders. We're giving it to you to invest in R&D.
Here at the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, there's been a lot of talk now about industrial policy, particularly the Inflation Reduction Act as well as the CHIPS and Science Act. And so we have somebody who has actually run some things in his life. He is Dave Cote. He's the former CEO, of course, of Honeywell, and he's now Executive Chairman of Vertiv. So, Dave, great to have you here.
Thanks.
I always said when it comes to industrial policy, if we're going to have it, why don't we have Dave Cote in charge of it? What do you think about the CHIPS and Science Act? What do you think about some of the big industrial policy that's coming out of Washington right now? It's a lot of money involved.
Yeah. Well, when you think about industrial policy, it tends to be kind of a secular, a mobilizing event, left or right, and people are either absolutely for it or absolutely against it. When the reality is, there's always been some kind of industrial policy in the country. You're going back to establishing the railroads, establishing canals, the interstate system, NASA to put somebody on the moon. I mean, there's always been that kind of, the trick is to not let it go too far. Yeah. So how do you find that, kind of right spot? So I'm not completely against it, but you got to be smart about it, because it's very easy once politics starts to intrude, politics will triumph good judgment all the time. So you want to make sure you don't lose the good judgment side of it. You asked about the CHIPS Act, and I would say, I'm a bit ambivalent about the whole thing. In terms of what they think it's going to accomplish, I don't think they're even close. And if you take a look at the percent of chips that it'll actually affect, it's, estimates from 3 to 5% of the total. It's not the super high-end difficult chips. And the know-how required to make those chips doesn't exist in the US anymore. Most of it exists in Taiwan. And this, with the exception of maybe the R&D spending that they're doing, doesn't really address any of that. So we're spending a lot of money that doesn't exactly solve the problem, which is how do you create a more domestic capability when it comes to being able to produce these super high-end chips. We should be able to figure that out, because a lot of the equipment to make these chips is made in the US. So you would think that if we spent money in the right places to say, how do we really learn how to do this, that would be, I think, much more efficient and effective spending than just building plants to produce chips that really aren't all that essential.
So in general, Dave, a lot of people say we should look to industrial policy for the things that only the government can do. If the private sector can do it, let them do it. In the area of chips, are there things that only the government can do that we actually have to turn to the government and ask them to do it for us?
Well, I think the better place for them to be spending their money is more on the R&D side, or providing incentives for people to learn how to produce those chips here. And I don't really see that. One of the things I would like to talk about, though, in industrial policy is we spend a lot of time talking about bringing manufacturing jobs back to the US, like manufacturing jobs solve all our economic problems. And that's a little backwards, I think. And we were in the agricultural age, went to the industrial era, now we're in the digital age. And if we were smart, we'd be doing the same thing that all our counterparts did 100, 150 years ago, when they said there's this shift to an industrial economy. We need kids to be able to be literate and numerate if they're going to be successful in this kind of environment. Now we're going to the digital age. And instead of saying, all right, how do we educate our kids? How do we prepare them to be able to be successful in a world like this? Instead, we're saying, no, let's make sure that we can keep all the manufacturing jobs here because these will pay well. It'd be a little like if 130 years ago, politicians and business people had said, God, with this industrial thing, man, that's going to be a lot of trouble. We need to find a way to keep people on the farm. Right? I mean, it's totally backwards. So I'd rather see an industrial policy that focused more on education for all our kids to say, how do we prepare them for this digital age, which is going to go on for another 80 years or so until something new comes around. This is going to be with us for a while.
You mentioned R&D.
Yeah.
Why can't the private sector do that? I mean, you had a big R&D budget, right?
Yeah.
I mean, all the big corporations have big R&D budget. Why can't the private sector give us the R&D that we need?
Yeah, I think that's one of the misconceptions about R&D is always talked about like it's a single thing. But it's two words, right? It's research, development. Well, development takes stuff that was developed in research and turns it into viable products. If you were to take a look at all company spending on R&D together, I wouldn't be surprised if you found 90 to 95% of it was spent on development. Because research is just too iffy, too expensive. The chances of it turning into something generally can be pretty small. And that's one where I do think the government has a big role to play in just doing this basic research that's available to all US companies, so that as they start finding these things, companies can then take them and develop into products and services that'll be useful. It's one of the areas I think we're falling down a bit, and for me, this would be good industrial policy, is a lot more money going into research, whether it's health, anything digital, bioengineering, all those things that are going to be very important to us in this century.
What about climate? Another big aspect of industrial policy right now is the move toward green energy, essentially.
Yep.
A lot of money is going into that right now. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I'm a fan of figuring out how do you keep land, air, and water as neutral as possible. We're putting a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, so figuring out how can we do this in a more neutral way, I think is a good idea. However, we shouldn't be thinking that this is going to solve climate change. If you really believe that CO2, and believe all the models, that CO2 lasts for 100 years in the atmosphere, is going to be there. We don't get to net zero as a globe for till 2050 or something. And remember, the US is only like 14 or 15% of all emissions. That means global warming is coming whether we get to zero or not. It's coming.
Let's assume, Dave, that we decide we need industrial policy, whether it's in chips or whether it's in forms of climate, and we decide we need to spend this much money on it. How should we go about doing it? I mean, I think back in World War II, I think FDR basically turned to U.S. industry to help really drive a lot of the industrialization that helped the United States and the Allies win the war. How would we go about really figuring out who should administer the industrial policy?
Well, if you go back to that time, what they actually did was take a number of business leaders and brought them into government in order to run a lot of these things, which I still don't think is a bad idea. And I found myself thinking, even when we were in the midst of COVID and we couldn't find basic products, there just weren't enough of them, I often thought, why don't they assemble a group of retired CEOs and assign them tasks to say, go figure this out, as opposed to just having a bunch of government-y types do it. And yeah, I'd say that possibility still exists.
Well, we have a retired CEO right here. Are you volunteering, Dave?
I don't know that I'm that retired or retired enough to be able to do that at this point.
Hey, Dave, great to have you on Wall Street Week. Thanks so much for being here. Dave Cote, he's the executive chair of Vertiv. Coming up, a stronger economy and a bit less inflation. What does that tell the Fed about where it should head next on interest rates? We're going to talk to two regional Fed presidents, Austan Goolsbee of Chicago and Raphael Bostic of Atlanta. That's coming up next on Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. From Aspen, Colorado, for our Bloomberg television and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Westin. I'm delighted to be joined right now by the president of the Chicago Fed. He is Austan Goolsbee. Austan, thanks for being here.
You bet.
So we're out here for the Aspen Economic Strategy Group meetings. A lot of talk about fiscal issues, monetary issues, but we all have now the key jobs figures. A little bit lighter than expected, 187,000 instead of 200,000. A little heavier than expected on the wages. What did you take on them?
job market is cooling a little to kind of a balanced level, but it's still extremely strong. That's the strongest part of the economy by far, is how low the unemployment rate is, and people can get a job if they want a job.
But what about the wages? We're now, these numbers were 4.4% year over year, I believe it was. That doesn't sound like something consistent with getting to 2% inflation overall.
The way I view it is two things. One, you can't say anything about wages until you actually know what's happening with productivity. We got some productivity numbers. They were strong for the quarter. That's very noisy, but if you have strong productivity growth, you can have wage growth and it doesn't generate inflation. And the other thing about wages is they're not a leading indicator of price inflation. They're backward looking. Wages move more slowly. When things happen, we get shocks, the prices move first and then the wages. So when we see what's happening to wages today, this is kind of an amalgam of a bunch of stuff that already occurred. I think if you want to know if you're beating inflation, go watch the inflation. You know, the price series, and especially the new months of inflation in the core. That's really what you want to be watching.
What are those numbers telling you right now, particularly goods inflation? Is it a bit stickier than you thought?
It has been, but the last couple of readings have been pretty positive. It's important that you raise this goods. Loosely, if you look at core inflation, you got goods, you got housing, you got services, not including housing. And we've much remarked on the stickiness and persistence of services inflation. But we knew that's not where we went wrong over at the end of last year, beginning of this year, with inflation lasting a little longer than we thought. It has been that goods prices, while down, have not gone all the way down to where they were before the pandemic. I feel like that's kind of started, and that's put the Fed on this line. I mean, it's a thin line to walk, but getting the prices down without having a big recession, we're going to Johnny Cash this thing and walk that line, and that's for sure the goal.
So, Austan, we talk about things like the jobs numbers as if there's one national number, when in fact we know there's no one national number. Indeed. There's a lot of individual numbers all around the economy. You have a region that absorbs a fair amount of the economy. Give us a sense of the variation across your region.
Yeah, so the region of the Chicago Fed is almost, but not quite exactly, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. So it's kind of heart of the Midwest. It's got a lot of industrial. It's the most manufacturing intensive of all the Fed districts. There's a lot of food, there's professional services, transportation and logistics. That's a lot of the distinctive concentration. But as you point out, there's a wide variability within that region. So I went to Des Moines, and in Iowa, the unemployment rate is down in the low 2%. And when you talk to people there about, hey, what do you think? Some people think it might be a recession. They what? we can't find anyone. Where if you go to regions where they're more right on the edge of the business cycle, the unemployment rate in some urban areas can be well elevated compared to rural areas or in industries where things are booming. The thing I would say that's been unusual about this business cycle has really manifested in the district, which is normally manufacturing is the most cyclical part of the economy. And so it's really at the bleeding edge of the business cycle, and everybody wants to go out to Flint, Michigan, and various places that are industrial to get a sense of where we are in the business cycle. But this downturn from COVID was centered in services, and manufacturing actually went up over people bought more cars and TVs and stuff like that. The RVs in Elkhart, I went out, but the very first speech I gave was out in Elkhart. We toured the RV plant, and the demand for RVs was through the roof. You can't believe how much, how intense the job market competition was there. So as we come into this recovery, it doesn't look like it normally does, even within the district.
So we got the jobs numbers on Friday at the end of the week. a little lighter on the number of jobs, a little heavier on the wage increases. How did you interpret them?
So they actually came in pretty much as I expected. You know, I've expected the economy to slow down in a fairly orderly way, and this number, the 187, comes in continuing that pace. Some folks would have liked it to be faster and a larger gap, but I'm comfortable. I'm not expecting this to be over in a short period of time. In terms of the wages, it doesn't surprise me that wages are still strong. You know, during this whole high inflation period, worker wages have trailed inflation for quite some time. And so we're still in that catch-up period, and I expect that we will still see strong wages. But I'll tell you, when I talk to employers, the one thing they tell me is that whatever they're setting their wage growth at this year, they're expecting it to be lower next year, and then lower again after that to get back to where we were pre-pandemic. So, you know, we got to keep an eye on it, of course, but I was not concerned too much about that at this point.
And I'm sure you'd be the first to tell me one data point isn't enough to make a decision, but do you feel that the Fed is on the trajectory it needs to be on to get to 2% at some point?
I do. You know, we are today in a restrictive stance, and as inflation continues to fall, the degree to which it's restrictive actually grows as that gap between the inflation rate and our interest rate widens. So I think that will put enough constraint on the economy that it will continue to slow. But again, I'm not expecting this to be, you know, a 2-month or a 3-month period. My outlook is that we'll still be in a restrictive territory well into 2024, and it'll just take a while for the inflationary pressures that we've seen over the last year and a half to fully dissipate and get us back to 2%.
You'll need to see some more data before you come up with a position on where you should be headed in the future meetings. But what data points particularly will you be focused on?
So I'm looking at really 3 things. The first is the actual inflation rate. So we got to make sure that inflation is not moving away from target or even starting to stall. The second is the breadth of inflation. So in all of these indices, you know, they track the prices for a number of different goods. At the height of the inflation trouble, 80% of the goods they tracked had inflation rates of 5% or more. Today, it's 28%, and this is in the CPI, and then in the ordinary times, it's 15 to 20. So we can get back to that, that's a great thing. And then the third is expectations, because as you know, people make decisions based on what they expect things to be in the future. And if they start to expect that inflation is going to be different than our 2% target, and that's not what's happening now, then they're going to make different decisions. And our economic capacity will be lower, and we definitely want to make sure that doesn't happen.
You talk about the breadth of the inflation. Let's talk about it breadth in a different sense. You are responsible for a good-sized region of the country. There have to be variations within that region. I mean, you got Atlanta, you got Miami, you got a lot of rural areas. As you look at that region, where do you see the biggest variations that we should be paying attention to?
Well, there are a good number of them. And, you know, it's funny that you say that, because, you know, my district is all or parts of 6 states in the southeastern United States, very large and very diverse. And right before the pandemic, we were using a theme, one district, many economies. And so when you look across the southeast, you have the big metros, Atlanta, Nashville, Tampa. These places are growing fast. There's a lot of pressure on housing as a result, but the trajectory there is very positive.
What are the best investments from your point of view, from what you understand, that will drive the most productivity?
Well, I think there are 2 things. You know, the first is I know that a lot of businesses have been thinking about how do they improve their processes, introduce automation that allows them to get more done with less. And that's happening across the board. You go to a restaurant now, oftentimes you do the ordering on a screen, and that reduces the baseline cost and increases productivity. And then the second is really to invest in our workers, to make sure that they're getting the skills that allow them to compete for the jobs of tomorrow. When you think about all the automation that's happening, all the new manufacturing, it's a different set of skills that workers need relative to what they needed in the old factory. And we need to make sure that we're investing in ways that allow our workforce more broadly to be competitive, to participate, and then get those higher wages.
Raphael Bostic, thank you so much for joining us. That's Raphael Bostic. He is the president of the Atlanta Fed. Coming up, it's not too late to add to your summer reading list. We're going to get some ideas from the luminaries here at the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. That's coming up next on Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is a special edition of Wall Street Week coming to you from Aspen, Colorado. As we near the end of the summer, it's still not too late to make sure we read all those books we meant to at the beginning of the summer. But there may have been a couple that we missed, and so we asked some of the luminaries here at the Aspen Economic Strategy Group for their recommendations, maybe for some things we want to add to our list.
Well, first, I hope everybody plans to read this fall my forthcoming book. It's called Two-Parent Privilege, and it's about the wide class divide in family structure that exists in the U.S. now, and how a two-parent family and all the advantages associated with that are really becoming yet another advantage of the college-educated class. So that's, I have to put in my plug for that, David. A book I recently finished was an advanced copy of a memoir called Troubled by Rob Henderson. Really a profoundly moving book. It's a vulnerable, beautiful account of a young man who grew up in the U.S. foster care system, got himself into the U.S. military and eventually to Yale University. And now he's looking back and has some really just profound thoughts on his life. And it makes you think as a reader about life circumstances, strength of character, and it makes us wonder and think hard about what we can do to reform our institutions to take better care of vulnerable families and children in this country.
I'm just finishing up a book by Dr. Latia called Outlive. And it's a book about longevity and how best to achieve it. And it's important to me personally because as advanced in age as I am, I happen to have two young boys at home, and I want to be around to see them grow up. And so there's a personal message there for me, but it's really a great book for everybody, I think. Because it reorients your thoughts about how you take care of yourself and about our system of medicine in the U.S.
Also attending the Aspen Economic Strategy Group this year were David Axelrod, President Obama's key political advisor, and Karl Rove, who did the same for former President George W. Bush. David told us he just finished reading the novel Mr. Texas by Lawrence Wright. That is a comedy about Texas politics. While Carl this summer read The Good Country by John Locke, a history of the American Midwest, 1800 to 1900. And what am I reading? Well, I'm finally getting caught up on last year's list, Chip War, which I had put on my Kindle already, but Steve Ratner, our contributor, said, you just have to read the book, David, and he's so right. Almost done with it now. It explains so much about what's going on right now in the semiconductor world and why it is such a priority in Washington. That does it for this episode of Wall Street Week, coming to you from Aspen, Colorado. I'm David Westin. This is Bloomberg. See you next week in New York.